here for an evening with Cathy Park Hong. Very exciting. I am Emlyn Guinea. I am the Senior Manager of Events with CIIS Public Programs, and I want to welcome you here, those of you who are in the room here, and then we have quite a few online as well. And I want to start by saying that we're gathered tonight in San Francisco, also known as Yelamu, on the traditional unceded land of the Ramaytush Ohlone people. I acknowledge the Ramaytush people, their traditions, contributions, and their enduring presence as the original people and continual caretakers of Yelamu. This acknowledgement is just one small step towards being in right relationship with Indigenous tribes and organizations in our community. I encourage you to learn more about the Native communities near you and to support their causes and their work. So this evening, there will be a Q&A after the conversation between Stephanie and Cathy. And for those of you who are here in the room, you'll find programs on your seats that link to a QR code where you can type in a question. And for those of you who are online, you'll have a link right below this video that will go to the same question form, and we'll collect your questions throughout the conversation, and we'll try to get to as many as we can. For those of you who are online, please note that the chat is enabled during this event, but it is not moderated and our presenters cannot see it. This evening is a co-production between CIIS Public Programs and CIIS's Clinical Psychology Department. So before we invite Cathy to the stage, it's my pleasure to introduce clinical psychology faculty David Cushman and Stephanie Chen. David Cushman is a licensed clinical psychologist. He is a core faculty member of the PsyD program at CIIS and has a private practice in Oakland where he sees children, teens, adults, and couples. He has written, presented, and published on community and school-based mental health, whiteness and racism, and professional basketball, all from a psychoanalytic perspective. Stephanie Chen is a 1.5 generation Chinese American immigrant and cisgender female licensed clinician, psychologist, and professor who practices, teaches, and writes from a depth-oriented, multicultural, and liberatory lens. Stephanie has clinical experience in providing direct clinical services to children, youth, adults, and families in outpatient, hospital, school-based, and private practice settings. In addition, she has provided individual and group supervision to trainees and staff from different stages of their professional development. So now, David, I will pass it on to you. Thank you.
So I'm just going to say a few quick thank yous. First, thanks to Emlyn. It was such a pleasure to co-plan this event with you. You made things really easy, which I greatly appreciate. And everyone from events, Yuritsa and her team, and everyone else at CIIS who helped make this event happen. And a special thank you to our provost, Kathy Littles, for supporting this and our other PsyD events. And finally, if this event piqued your interest and you are considering graduate school, please check out CIIS PsyD. We are a unique and different program within the ecosystems of clinical psychology, holding transpersonal, psychoanalytic, and liberatory frameworks. We think we have something important to offer the field. Now, finally, I'd like to introduce Professor Cathy Park Hong. When I read her book, Minor Feelings, which is right here, here's my copy, reading it was like being blasted with air, intense, difficult, and exhilarating. And I knew that Cathy had something important to say to clinical psychology. And I'm so glad she's here and that our very own and brilliant Dr. Stephanie Chen will be in conversation with her. So Cathy Park Hong is an award-winning poet and essayist whose book Minor Feelings is a searching work that ruthlessly reckons with the American racial consciousness. Hong weaves together personal stories, historical context, and cultural criticism to ultimately create an emotional and impactful exploration of Asian American personhood. Minor Feelings is the 2020 recipient of the National Book Critics Circle Award for autobiography. Hong is the author of several books of poetry and is the recipient of notable awards such as the Wyndham Campbell Prize. In her moving talks, she offers a fresh and honest perspective on race and Asian American identity, discusses how poetry and writing can be a means for understanding ourselves and our world, and comments on the ways politics and culture are influenced by art and vice versa. So we're going to bring out Cathy and Stephanie right now. So please come out and let's welcome them.
Should I start?
Yes, please.
Hi. I was told that I should talk for a moment, and it's a little daunting, I think, to just start talking, but I will. I wanted to do something a little unscripted and see how that goes, but I have to say I'm really, really honored to be here and talking to you, and many of you whom are getting a degree in, what is it,
Clinical psychology.
in clinical psychology. And I think it's, I don't know where I would be without my therapist. So I thank you all. But also, when my book, Minor Feelings, begins with me falling into a depression, and then seeking out a therapist. And I I really wanted to find a Korean American therapist because I guess I thought of it as a life hack. Like, if I went to see a Korean American therapist and I didn't have to explain my problems, she would just know. It's like just a shortcut. Like, she just knew. And if you read the book, you'd see that you know that what happened was that when I saw the therapist, she went through sort of like a list of symptoms. She was asking me for a list of symptoms, and then she asked me, "Have you ever felt comfort in your childhood?" And I could not think of a single moment. And then I burst into tears, and something really broke through. And I realized that she was the one I had to see her. And then she ghosted me. So this is what happens in the book, and this is what actually happened in my life. And but I wouldn't accept that because I was so desperate. And I called her, harassed her, and called her a number of times. I thought because I was calling her office phone that she wouldn't know how many times I was calling her. And then I was like, oh wait, maybe she has caller ID. But eventually we talked. I remember I was at the Dallas airport getting Mexican food, and she told me that we weren't right for each other. And I was so flabbergasted. I didn't realize that finding a therapist was like dating, that your therapist could reject you. So I asked her why, and she said, "I can't give you that information." And I was like, "What?" What? And then that was that. And then I found a Jewish therapist who I've been seeing ever since. But what I want to say is, since the book has come out, I have met many Asian American therapists, including Korean American therapists. And it's been really just heartening to have conversations with them and to see them really committed and really committed, and to see their care and passion and interest in breaking into psychotherapy, which has been, predominantly white. And from what I hear, it's been diversifying, not without some struggle. And I think that is really essential, really crucial, because, I'm working, I just finished a novel, and it does have a lot of psychoanalysis. I mean, in it, I was reading Lacan while I was writing the book, and because it has a lot to do with mothers, of course. And but I think I've really been interested in psychotherapy and mental health. Just, I mean, I write about it in Minor Feelings, but it's also something that I'm interested in this book that I'm working on because I really think there's I mean, it's also been widely written on that there's a huge treatment gap between, say, Westerners with means who get diagnosed for every little thing, and I was living in New York and everyone sees a therapist. It's like going to yoga. But then there are also immigrants or just the people in other countries like Korea where psychotherapy is still very much a taboo, psychiatry and psychotherapy. Um, and I think about that a lot, that huge treatment gap that happens and how there isn't the language to even treat, women from, let's say, immigrant women who come from other countries, women of color, that it's very much filtered through this Western lens of psychotherapy or the DSM-5, right, which doesn't capture. I don't think it captures everything. And I grew up, you know, um, in a community, I think, where there were a lot of just, my friends or people I know whose mothers suffered or experienced some kind of distress, but they were never able to, they never got diagnosed, they never sought help, there was no language for what they endured. And, I think including my own mother, who's not the mother in the book, by the way, the mother in the book is like a composite. And, and I think like when you're growing up under that kind of upbringing and there's no language for it, there's no support for it, you think it's your fault, right? Or you think there's something wrong with you. And it's like, and I was also just recently teaching Viet Thanh Nguyen's book. He's a brilliant writer. If you haven't heard of him, he wrote The Sympathizer, which won the Pulitzer Prize in 2015 or 2016 or something. And he wrote a book called Man of Two Faces. And he talks about how his mother, who worked all the time, owned a grocery store with his father, and they had sort of the success story. And I think this is also just what's very frustrating, or just what's the contradiction in the Asian American experience, that on paper, immigrants can achieve look like they've achieved something, right? So they owned a grocery store and they moved to like an upper middle class home, but then his mother had some kind of breakdown and was admitted to the hospital. And he was saying that he just blocked it out from memory. He just didn't remember it. And he thought it was happened when he was a kid, like when he was 5 or, when he was 7 or something. And then when he was looking at his diary entries while he was working on the memoirs, as traumatic as that, and, if he said that in an entry, he began writing that his mother was admitted and then didn't say anything more. But it was clear to me when I was like reading his book and talking about his book with the students that there was just he didn't know how to describe what his mother went through. And, there was, of course, intergenerational trauma, the trauma of the Vietnam War, and being a refugee and being forced to escape, and the kind of so hardship she had to face here, that definitely had something to do with it. But there was still that, like, her distress wasn't legible in such a way that even her son couldn't face it in any kind of way. And so I've been fascinated or just interested in that gap, that sort of lacuna of of illegibility where there are immigrant women. Like it's interesting to me that, for instance, like I heard something about how immigrant women have the highest have highest level of schizophrenia. I don't know if that's actually true, but I've heard if that's statistically still true. But and it's also like, when I talk to my own therapist, she's always saying like, why do you have to diagnose everything? Why do you have to put a name to it? And I think it's like, in a way, it's about gaining some kind of control, right? Like having some kind of control and knowing that, okay, this is what the problem is. But then at the same time, I also think there is, at least in Western culture, there is an overdiagnosis of maladies and that naming or trying to guess or trying to flip through the DSM-5 and figure out what's wrong with your dad or your mother or your grandmother or whatever is also sort of a fruitless endeavor in its own right. So, but I think finding support in some way and being able to talk about it and trying to kind of shrink that treatment gap in a way. And for psychiatric medicine, I'm conflating the two, I'm sorry, therapy and also psychiatric medicine for it to expand beyond sort of the Western ways of looking at ourselves or the idea of the self, is absolutely essential. So
Cathy, thank you so much. And I want to pick up some points maybe in our conversation a little bit. So here are my remarks. My copy of Cathy Park Hong's Minor Feelings is full of exclamation points, question marks, and marginal notes. I restrained myself from highlighting the entire book, even though so much resonated with me or made me want to revisit again and again. Cathy's words reflected my own thoughts and experiences. They sounded like those of my Asian American clients and my students. They sounded like my family and many other families I have worked with. Her collection of essays functioned as a mirror, offering an opportunity for my own reckoning with my Asian American consciousness and unconsciousness. A process that has been illuminating, uncomfortable, and full of still unanswerable questions. I took Cathy's words on page 39, where she says, "What the fuck am I doing here? Who am I writing for?" as my inspiration for my reflections today. I offer these remarks in response to her call, as well as to other Asian American thinkers and psychoanalysts who have been urging more contributions to an Asian American canon, one in which we are not objects of the white gaze, but investigators and proclaimers of our own subjectivity, and perhaps too, a collective intersubjectivity. As an Asian American clinician working primarily with Asian American clients, I approach this work from a professional, social, and personally situated perspective. It is informed by my immigration story of being born in Taiwan, raised by maternal grandparents until I was 6, before joining my parents in New York City. A young girl who learned English fluency by listening to Whitney Houston, Michael Jackson, and Bon Jovi, and survived difficult latency in adolescent years in predominantly white schools when all I wanted was to belong and be like my peers. My undergraduate degrees in psychology and an independent Asian American studies taught me to yell, to be angry, and to say no, and to engage in civil protest. My clinical training and orientation are grounded by a love of psychoanalytic and multicultural theories. These multiple parts shape how I listen, interpret, and make meaning alongside my clients, and informs the reflections that follow. I recognize an electric undercurrent within and around me. I feel stirred and acutely of my desire of refusal, to refuse being neutralized, obedient, pliable, digestible, or easily categorizable within the many Asian American stereotypes built on binaries and a lack of imagination. I carry with me the essence of ancestors, connected through blood or spirit. I bring with me my teachers and elders and colleagues, people like David Yang, Xin-Yi Hong, Mary Kim Brewster, Usha Tumalanara, Chris E., Joseph Reynoso, Claire Jean Kim, Anne Anlin Chen, John Okada, David Henry Huang, and Renee Tachima Pina, to name a few. And of course, always my Asian American clients, students, and supervisees. Being Asian American is marked by both visibility and hyper-visibility. Asian Americans are significantly underrepresented in research study, regardless of field. We are often considered too heterogeneous or too homogeneous to study, or not compelling enough to incite interest or curiosity. I recall a striking statistic. The National Institute of Health allocated less than 1%, specifically 0.17% of the total funding to Asian health between 1992 and 2018, despite Asians comprising about 6% of the US population. As a result, we lack sufficient data to understand the state of Asian health. Instead, there is widespread assumption that Asians and Asian Americans are well. Additionally, as Asian Americans are often positioned as close to whiteness, white models of prevention, treatment, and care are applied to Asian American patients without question. My 20+ years of clinical experience tell a different story. Asian American children, adolescents, adults, couples, and families struggle deeply with mental health and wellness. At the same time, Asian Americans become hypervisible in ways that reinforce exoticization or perceived threat, or as tools to distinguish us from other people of color. Regarding the former, I recall numerous occasions when teachers called on me to explain the cultural significance of the Lunar New Year, the symbolism within Chinese culture, or whether my family had a recipe for fried rice to share. These examples may seem less overtly offensive than what occurred during COVID-19 pandemic, when on a global scale, stereotypes of Asians and Asian Americans re-emerged as the yellow peril, the Asian invasion, a faceless foreign invading horde carrying disease and contamination. In terms of the latter, I want to highlight 2 points. The myth of Asian Americans as a model minority is used to uphold the illusion of meritocracy in the United States. we are portrayed as successful due to, quote, strong values and a strong work ethic, in contrast to other minoritized groups who are framed as undeserving and never deserving. Second, the model minority myth continues to be weaponized in service of white supremacy and anti-Blackness. Positioned as middlemen within a racial hierarchy, Asian Americans must contend with an honest reckoning with anti-Blackness. Political scientist Claire Jean Kim writes that, quote, "It is more precise to say that Asian Americans are dynamically constituted as not white, but above all, not Black." I am not advocating for self-flagellation of complicity. I am also not advocating an erasure or minimalization of our own traumas, but rather for a more comprehensive analysis that incorporates Kim's, but also Eng and Han's frameworks. By doing so, we can get beside our guilt and shame to construct a more expansive Asian American consciousness. When I think about the psychic and emotional lives of Asian Americans, I am reminded of something actor Steven Yeun said, quote, "Sometimes I wonder if the Asian American experience is what it's like when you're thinking about everyone else, but nobody else is thinking about you." This observation captures the heart of Cathy's essays. The emotional and psychic lives of Asian Americans are not minor or superficial. However, our experiences are often flattened, dismissed, and rendered invisible. Not only do others perceive us this way, but we also internalize these beliefs consciously and unconsciously. We are the unthought subject within the broader American racial consciousness. I like to present a clinical vignette composed of several Asian American clients to further illustrate. Sammy is a 30-year-old cisgender second-generation Chinese American woman who sought psychotherapy after experiencing another major depressive episode. She had recently moved back home with her parents during COVID-19. Over 5 years of work, Sammy repeatedly questioned whether her struggles were valid or worthy of attention. Whether talking about her depression or experiences with racism and sexism, she frequently compared herself to others and minimized her own suffering. Amidst acknowledging her relative privilege, her guilt remained constant. She perceived her challenges as insignificant compared to others, and that others' suffering was greater or more important than hers. We returned again and again to her conflicted feelings, shame and guilt about taking up space, alongside moments of relief when she allowed herself to believe her pain was legitimate. Another theme in our work involved her desire to build a life that deviated from expected timelines and milestones. Sammy understood what it meant to be a good Chinese daughter, often measured through conventional success, defined by familial, cultural, and social standards. This expectation conflicted with her aspirations in the performing arts. She felt indebted to her parents' support while simultaneously burdened by their disappointment. She often asked, quote, "How do I repay my parents if I haven't made it?" I also heard in Sammy's plea the impossibility of fulfilling the edicts of filial piety, a value treasured and passed down her family, and being a model minority. These tensions were compounded by a medical leave we secured a year ago, followed by her recent resignation due to ongoing grief about her grandmother's death and increasing workplace stress. This culminated in another depressive episode that now included persistent suicidal ideation. Our sessions were filled with her cries of despair. Sammy felt torn about leaving her job, what her parents would say about it, and the serious concerns of her emotional fragility. It was common for Sammy to say out loud that perhaps it was easier for her to not exist, as she would no longer disappoint her parents and her friends would not have to worry about her. Her belief that not existing, her absence would bring relief to others, was heartbreaking to hear. Interpersonally, Sammy yearns to fall in love. COVID-19 and her immunocompromised state limited her ability to date, and the shift to online interactions complicated things further. As an Asian American woman, she continues to be acutely aware of safety concerns, especially amid rising anti-Asian violence. She knows what is expected for her to attract more right swipes, but she is not interested in populating her dating profile to be a list of Asian American female stereotypes. Sammy is not interested in fulfilling someone's Asian fetish, and yet feels the pull to be attractive and desirable. We reuse the reframes of, quote, for what and whose gain, and, quote, what and whose cost, to prompt her exploration and processing of her ambivalence. It's important, I think, to note a contrast. Many of my Asian American heterosexual male clients face near total exclusion in dating spaces, often ranking lowest in physical attractiveness and sexual desirability. It is not uncommon to see profiles explicitly state, quote, no Asians in those circumstances. As Sammy's therapist, I'm aware of both of our shared identities and of our differences. I am at times an object for projections. In my work with Sammy, I have been her disappointing parents and employers, and her disappointed friend and older sibling, and indifferent love interests. Her guilt and shame are achingly familiar. Her own disappointment and anger towards me and our treatment have populated our sessions over the past 5 years, and it's been hard work. At the same time, I am also a subject. My clients evoke strong emotions and memories. I recognize aspects of their experiences in myself, and at times too close. I feel the weight of structural forces, and at many times a sense of hopelessness. I also feel rage on their behalf and on my own. I close with the following. I am continually reminded of the depth and richness of my Asian American clients' inner lives. The stereotype of Asian American clients lacking interiority or emotional variability is broken by each client who enters my practice. While frustrated at times, none of my clients expect me to teach or tell them what to do. My belief in building a strong therapeutic relationship remains paramount. My approach of, quote, being with my Asian American clients has created a space where all of them are welcomed, which I think has supported their articulation, including silence, supported their expression and their creativity. I am humbled by how willing my Asian American clients are to dwell in the shadows, to be stuck in the unknown with me. I am moved by my clients and their resolve. They are more aware of their Asian American subjectivity and its relationship to structural, psychic, and cultural pressures. Together, we have been able to think and to feel, which has opened up individual and social imaginings of new possibilities, including pursuing unexpected paths. So when I circle back to Cathy's prompt of what the fuck am I doing here, I would reply for myself, for Sammy, and perhaps an Asian American collective, that to be seen, to be heard, and to be recognized is exactly what we deserve. So Cathy, shall we start a conversation?
Sure.
Yeah. Well, maybe we can start off. Anything you want to follow up from your talk earlier?
I mean, I said what I said. And Stephanie, thank you for that beautiful talk. But I think it really segged into what I was saying. Really segged into what you were saying about Asian Americans really desiring, lacking in therapy, and finding belonging, and a way to understand themselves, and always minimizing their identity. I was going to talk about maybe what I could talk a little bit about just what I've been feeling since I've written Minor Feelings. And for those who don't know, minor feelings is an affective condition that I write about where, and it's not particular to Asian Americans. I would say that it's, anyone who feels marginalized in some way, where it's a spectrum of shame, paranoia, depression, melancholia, what have you, that they feel when they are their kind of racialized reality, or is not commensurate, or is not recognized by the larger culture, by the larger dominant culture, the state apparatus that is the US. And, it's specific to Asian Americans, of course, that applies to the mono minority, and how they're promised the American dream. There's this expectation that they would succeed, when in fact they feel there's tremendous inadequacy, partly because of, and not to totalize the Asian American experience, but maybe they experience some kind of conditional love, love that was very conditional and contingent upon how they behave, rather than something that's like foundational to just their relationship with their parents. And so they feel this real sense of insufficiency and inadequacy. And of course, also, as you were talking about, the hyper invisibility that they feel in the US, which is a very real problem. I mean, even to this day, when you look at polls for presidential elections, or any state, like, the Asian Americans are always other. You have, like, and it's always frustrating to me, you have African Americans, Latinos, and other, and it's like, and we are the fastest growing minority in this country. I do think that there's been the stakes are much higher now. And it's funny, I wrote Minor Feelings during Trump 1.0, and now we are in Trump 2.0. And I don't know. I'm just, I think in some ways, when I think about Minor Feelings, this is not, especially more now than ever, that it is definitely not isolated to Asian Americans. This is an affective condition that we all feel. But at the same time, at this point, no one believes very few people believe in the American mythos. You know, I think that has been, that mask has been torn off, you know, and I don't, maybe there's still immigrants who really still adhere to that belief that America is exceptional. But I think we are in a very disenchanted period where if you didn't know before uh, that the US is collapsing, right? That's the belief. And I think, you know, for those, for many people of color, they knew that this was America for a very long time. This was America that they lived for a long time. This is just America unmasked with a more fascistic tenor. And so for me, it's, I think it's like not enough just to think about Asian American identity. I think it's really essential. It's like, it's so essential to use the tools of mental health. I mean, I'd say more than tools, but I would say it's so important to use mental health, community, art, you know, any kind of support you can get to find that belonging. But we can't end with belonging. Belonging is not the end goal. After that, you have to really think about what solidarity means. And that means that, you know, finding the spirit within you to fight, you know, to fight. We need to fight and find joy in that fighting. This is what we have to do. We are in an emergency. And I think about this because I think, you know, today I just saw how in Tennessee, like there was they voted, the state, Tennessee voted 9-0 to like redistrict Memphis. And so that the Black representation would be wiped out, right? And in my book, I talk about, I write about 1965. 1965 was when they passed the Voting Rights Act, which SCOTUS just completely, which SCOTUS has completely, almost completely annihilated, right? Where there's voter protection, where there's when there's racial discrimination, and this was focused on Black Americans in the South, and that was that law passed in 1965. And then that same year, which I write about in Minor Feelings, they also passed the Hart-Celler Act. The Hart-Celler Act that Lyndon Johnson passed was the law that before it, there was, you know, there was a racial ban. It was a total racist ban on all immigrants coming to the U.S. except for a small portion of Northern Europeans. After the Hart-Celler Act, they opened it up to immigrants to other parts of the world. And Lyndon Johnson at the time said this will be just, this is an insignificant law. It's not going to affect, it's gonna make no difference in the makeup of this country. Au contraire, you know, I think like America was at the time was like over 80% white. Now the U.S. is going to be the minorities are going to be the majority, right? If things go naturally as planned by 2040, Project 2025, the Trump administration, all that are trying to undo the civil rights, rolling back Civil Rights Acts, Civil Rights Act, and also just undo the Hart-Celler Act so that the US will be 80% white. And I think what's really essential for Asian Americans who don't know their history is that the reason why they're here is because of the Civil Rights Act. That if it weren't for the civil rights movement, Lyndon Johnson would have never passed the Hart-Celler Act because it was because of racial segregation. Racial segregation was a bad look, right, in the US. And this was in the height of the Cold War. And they had to make themselves look like they were a country that was, if they were gonna say they were a free country, because the Cold War was all about a PR war. It was a PR war. They had to actually practice that freedom, and that's why they passed the Hart-Celler Act. So, you know, that's happening, ICE is happening, and so forth. So this is a moment where we have to really try to build bridges across Black, Asian American, Latino. We're all under attack. And not only that, there is a war abroad. And I keep thinking about the 60s, the late 60s, because there's so much, there are a lot of echoes and also a lot of progress that we're undoing now. For instance, the Vietnam War. Asian Americans, when it became a name, and we cannot forget this, was that it was an oppositional racial identity that was anti-imperialist and that was built solidarity with other Black Americans, with the Black Panthers. And this is happening again with the Gazan genocide and the war in Iran, that, you know, anti-Asian violence is not just what happened. I mean, the book came out before COVID. You know, and they were like, oh, this book is so timely. I'm like, anti-Asian hate has always been here, was always, you know, we're just paying more attention to it. And maybe it was more explicit during COVID times, but anti-Asian hate was, if you wanted the most devastating example of anti-Asian hate, was the imperial wars abroad. It was what was happening in Vietnam, in Korea, in Cambodia. And you see echoes of that. You know, I just see history returning constantly in Minnesota when, you know, I'm sure we've all seen the photo of the man, he was a father, he was Hmong, and he had nothing on, and he had like a blanket, and he was being hauled off by ICE, you know, and Hmong people, they were helping the US fight their the fight in Cambodia. And then when they had to finally end the war, they abandoned the Hmong community, like they abandoned the Afghanis who helped them in Afghanistan, and that led to a massive genocide. And this is also something that we don't talk about, were all the genocides that were happening in the US because of US interventions abroad. So when we think about the global history and global colonial problem, we see that Asian America is actually a global, what we face, and our own affective condition that comes from erasure and invisibility and also violence is something that Palestinians also face, that you know, that the Middle East, and this is also ways we can expand what Asian America is that it's not just East Asia or Southeast Asian, but West Asia as well. And then when we think about it, we have to understand that Asian America as a term is it's porous, it's coalitional, it's not about what country you're from, it's not territorial. I've been reading a lot of Edward Glissant, The Poetics of Relation, and he talks about, you know, when you feel relation is not so much you laying claim to another country, you laying claim to your home country, or the difference between a Zionist and an anti-Zionist. And Zionist would be like, Israel is the country that the Jewish people claim, whereas an anti-Zionist Jewish person would say, no, this is what we are of the diaspora. What we have in common is with other people who have been exiled and ejected from their homeland. And I think as Asian Americans, we can't just think about belonging and acceptance. We need that first. That is the first step. But the second step is to find then an affinity, allegiance with everyone else who have been ejected from their country of origin. and who are being threatened to be ejected from this country.
Cathy, I'm curious about, no doubt, this is the time to fight. And I wonder if, in your work with students, knowing what we are presented with right now in terms of our sociocultural political context, how do we think about joy, or how do we think about collective versus individual?
I think joy is absolutely essential. I mean, I think, I think about the maybe like the affective condition now, at least from what I mean, my students like on the surface seem to be doing fine. They seem to be like, they're hardworking, they're, and I don't pry into their private life. So I'm not like, so Timmy, what's really going on? Let's talk about it. I'm like, I don't get paid enough for that. So, and nor is it appropriate, I think. So I don't really know what's going on in their inner life exactly, but at least among the grad students I talked to and a little bit, there is still, I think there is fear. I think they feel fear and they feel overwhelmed and exhausted and angry. But I think there's more in anger that's a kind of paralysis. And a lot of that fear also comes from job precarity. There's just a lot of scarcity right now, right? Like I think before COVID, like during COVID, but before Trump came into office again, when I used to do a lot of talks, I would say people would ask, what brings you hope? And I would say the younger generation. And I still do think that. But my reason was because I feel like the younger generation are just much more aware. They believe much more about, they understand the need for equity, and they are so empowered in a way that I never was in my 20s. And I really believe that, I really believe that they're going to do the work. And I think that's unfair now because they're just going through so much. They've been through so much. And what they're now facing is economic precarity on top of, if you're someone who is, say, come from an immigrant family, or if you're someone of color, there's also the fear of your being a resident and being able to stay here. And so it's a different, more urgent idea of belonging. Like, belonging is essential. It's like belonging is, I need the documentation so I can remain in this country, So that really, so at least in Berkeley, there's a lot less, there were like, after the encampments, and there's also the chilling effect of universities cracking down on freedom of speech. So there's less protest, I think, less visible protest. I think it's happening locally, maybe with local communities and so forth. And there's just a lot of pressure. And I think that it's important to figure out and to understand and together how we can, change that kind of fear and exhaustion and numbness from doom scrolling and being overwhelmed by the 24-hour cyclone of bad news to action, and part of that action through, and to kind of transform into active rage and joy, right? And joy is like, doesn't mean, I'm very cynical, about this country. I've always have been. And for me to pretend and say, oh, it's going to be great, I'd be lying. I've always, but I still believe that there can be vitality within the crisis that we're in. And we have to kindle that vitality, that energy, that joy, and to use, there's so many examples of that, right? Like just in American history, this is what Black writers, Black artists, Black people talk about joy as a mode of subversion, joy as resistance, that even, and when we're not also in unprecedented times, there are indigenous people and Black people who have lived through slavery and just intense segregation all throughout, and then they managed to make incredible art and protest and demonstrate with both rage and joy. And we have to figure out how to harness that. It is much harder with the industry that makes its home in San Francisco, distracting us from how we can be productively enraged and productively find joy. But we need to find that by making art, building communities, having parties, going off the grid, or all of that, And I think that's something we need to think about, right?
Yeah. In terms of when you wrote this book to where we are now, when we talk about conversations about race, what feels different to you and what still feels the same?
I mean, I talked about what feels different and what feels the same. I think that what feels the same is, I mean, I think it's just the system, the neoliberal white supremacy is exposed, has been completely unmasked. And so I think that is sort of similar, except we are also facing sort of the existential threat of climate change, and also higher education and so forth. But I also think that there is a lot of solidarity. And I think of examples like what happened in Minnesota and the mutual aid groups that were there. I mean, there's, as I say, that there needs to be more resistance. I mean, I think about all the Minnesotans who were fighting, and that was multi-ethnic. It was everyone. It was, it was white, Black. Minnesota, Minneapolis has the biggest number of refugees, Hmong community, Somalians. I have a lot of friends who in Minneapolis who are poets of color, and they were very active in that fight. And that was really, I thought that was very empowering to see that, So that's one example. But I think it's also different. I mean, so much has changed, even during COVID and Black Lives Matter. There's been, people were more active and on the streets and protesting. There was a lot of movement in university campuses, but also I think there were also a lot of a lot of conflict between people of color as well, where it was more silo-sized because of social media. But I think it's hard to say. I think right now there's more interest in the fight abroad and how it's connected locally, internationally, and nationally.
Yeah. I would love to kind of come back to what you were talking about in terms of solidarity and finding kind of a connection across. And I think with a lot of minoritized groups, there is a lot of difficulty and continued grappling with anti-Blackness. I'm just curious about what are your musings and further exploration about that.
Yeah, I mean, I think, I mean, as I was saying before, that, you know, Asian Americans have to be aware that the civil rights, what Black people want benefits, what Black people fight for benefits Asian Americans, and you could say that for other groups. It's a different time. I would say it's a different time, even if you were to say like 4 years ago, it's quite different. Everyone is scared.
Yeah.
You know, it's not, I think the way racial groups were in conflict with Asian anti-Blackness in Asian American communities and all of that during COVID times, it's just different now because we're all in danger. And this is why I keep emphasizing, and I'm sure all of you already think this, is like, how do we build a movement that is not just pan-ethnic or pan-racial, but really think about one that intersects class and race, you know, and that is essential in thinking about how we unify Black, Asian, Latino, Indigenous solidarity is through class. And that may mean some disaggregation because there are a lot of Asian Americans who do come from upper income, who are just interested in that sort of neoliberal ethos of getting ahead, and who don't, and it's you know, the immigrant ethos is the immigrant ethos can be like the neoliberal ethos, where it's like, as long as I keep my head down and get ahead, and not care about other people who look different from me, like Black people or Latinos or whatever, then I will succeed. And so it's about sort of trying to convince them that this fight is everyone's fight.
Yeah.
Yeah.
If one group of people can't be free, then we all can't be free. It's a revision of a very famous quote. I'm seeing that we're kind of needing to maybe one or two more questions and then turn it over to the audience and their questions. Cathy, for people in the audience who may be grappling with their own minor feelings, what would you want them to hold on to?
I think I think it's care. Don't be so hard on yourself. Look to others for community, forgiveness, I think is very important. Even if you're not at fault of what you think you're at fault for, you have to forgive yourself, and, you know, find friendships with people who you trust and who accept you for who you are, and then expand that circle of friendship to others. You know, yeah.
Yeah. It almost sounds like isolation is not the answer.
Well, I'm an introvert, so
so am I.
I love spending a lot of time by myself. But it's important. I think it's like, one thing is that what I've noticed is that living here in the Bay Area is that everyone is so happy, at least in Berkeley, or they give off the vibe of happiness, which baffles me. they're always smiling and saying, "Hi, Sude." And, but I live in Berkeley. I know it may be different in San Francisco where, but in Berkeley, people can happily talk about gardening all day. And as a whiny New Yorker, I find it really hard to sort of wrap my head around. And I think, it's for me, it's kind of hard being here because it's like, I feel like my anger is not seen, and I don't know why. Like when I go back to New York or even LA, people are ranting, right? They're just ranting. You go out to first night, I go out to dinner with friends, they're like ranting, just about how this world sucks. Not here, And I think that's sort of that. And so, I don't know if this is like a geographic issue or if this is just people I hang out with. I think I am friends with like a few people out, I think I don't go out, but I know people. I still go out for an occasional drink with others and so forth. And I think it's like, there's maybe the sensibility from what I can detect where people just like at least in the Bay Area, which is different from the East Coast, is that you're like, you see it in the news all the time. It's on your feed all the time. So why do you have to talk about it too? And I find that really weird. And I think for me, like I want my anger to be seen in others. And when I do, I feel so much better. And I guess that's a thing with someone who's having minor feelings. This would be my minor feelings now, right? Like, is to talk to others and just not be afraid to let your ugly emotion show and to embrace it and not change the subject and say, well, but, there are these like, even if it's like, yes, like there are solutions, like, why don't you join the local activist group or something like local blah, 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 like just to actually just, because I think there's a lot of people who are scared and very angry, but they're trying not to be. And, that needs to be recognized, So I don't know if this is just the community that I happen to hang out with or it's because I live in Berkeley, but I do notice that how it's more of that. I get more of that in California. And I think it's because, yes, the weather is beautiful and that has a huge factor. But I grew up in LA and I hated the weather in LA. I always felt like the sun was like gaslit my gloominess. So I was really happy to move to the East Coast. Now I don't miss the winter, but yeah. So.
Cathy, any last words before we transition to the Q&A?
Oh, I would just like to hear from others. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So we have about 15 minutes. Okay. That's right. Okay. Cathy, do you have any advice for Asian Americans on addressing racial microaggressions?
Just be an asshole. I don't know. Just be outspoken. I don't know. I just, this happened to me. I don't know. When I first moved to Berkeley, I was like, okay, there's so many Asians here. And, someone called Berkeley the HBCU of Asian Americans. I don't know. I don't know if that was an appropriate analogy, but I thought it was interesting. But I thought that was what I was coming into. And yes, Berkeley is full of Asians. It's all Asians. You have Asians of every stripe. And, and I have a friend, not a friend, a student who's coming from, I think East Coast Asians are very different from West Coast Asians. Like, she came from New Jersey and she came here, and she's very angsty. Like East Coast Asians are angstier because they tend to be more, come from more in cities and towns where it's predominantly white. So she's like, she came here and she's like, it's really weird because there's so many Asians who are just chill. And, or just like Asians who come from predominantly, like who come from Irvine or San Jose or, you know, San Francisco. So they're just one of many, and they didn't, you know, they don't have the same sense of deeply entrenched alienation as she did when she growing up in a small white town in Jersey. But there was, so I was like, Asians everywhere, I'm never going to face a microaggression. But then where I live in North Berkeley, it's mostly white boomers. You know, Berkeley's like boomers and zoomers. And I was not expecting, like, it was not a NIMBYs. Some of them are NIMBYs. So I was surprised by how homogenous it was. But I was like I was outside on the street, and my daughter was riding her bike, and I was just watching her and everything. And my neighbor was like, "Hi, nice to meet you. You're our new neighbor." And I was like, "Yes, hi." Da, 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 da. And he's like, "Wow, your English is really good." And he's like, how is your English so good? I was like, I was flabbergasted. I was like, I can't believe I got that. I've never had that kind of different kinds of microaggression in New York, but it was such a you know, just like kind of a cliche. It's like such a cliched microaggression that I got. So the first time, so I said, I'm a Berkeley professor in the English department. No, first I said, I was born here. And then I said, I'm actually a professor, a full professor at UC Berkeley in the English department. And that shut him up. And then he went away. But then a week later, it was a month later. I ran into his a cousin or something. He was with his cousin who was up by his car, and he was like, "Hi." He was like, we're talking about real estate because that's a common conversation topic in Berkeley. And then he was like, really? And then he said something in a different language, and I was like, "Excuse me." And he's like, blah, blah, blah. He was speaking Chinese to me, and I was like, "I'm not Chinese." And he said, "Oh, I just thought you were Chinese. I just assumed." And that guy, my neighbor Scott, you know, I'm not going to give you his last name, so he won't be. He ran down, and I could tell that he was really sort of embarrassed. I didn't know what he was going to say, but I was so angry that I sent them an email. And I was just like, I can't believe, I just feel so, I feel like just uncomfortable in my own neighborhood. And instead of welcoming me, you make me feel like I'm an outsider. And I don't understand. You live in Berkeley. He was also a math teacher at Berkeley High. I was like, I am not sending my kid to Berkeley High. I was like, how could you, as a teacher teaching Asian Americans, not be more sensitive? You have to be more sensitive. I just told him off. I sent him an email, and I felt good about it. So you just have to just be direct. I don't know, be blunt. Maybe if it's your boss, it's a different story. It's a little harder. I don't know. I'd have to think about that and how you manage it. But with a similar situation, similar like mine, it's just like, dress them down.
Well, and I think this is connected to what you're talking about in terms of both having your anger being recognized and us being able to express anger at these moments.
Be angry. Stay angry. Well, there's also the social media anger, right? Like where you and I think that's very dangerous, right? Because that's a dopamine kind of anger where you're just like posting angry stuff, but it just it goes nowhere, you know? So I'm talking about IRL anger. Yeah.
Next question. How can non-Asian people of color show allyship with the Asian American community? Where do well-meaning folks get it wrong?
Non-Asian people of color.
Mhm.
I think just listening, you know, and just showing that you understand and not minimizing the racism that also Asian Americans might experience. I think, you know, when during COVID times, and before, there was a lot of like oppression Olympics, unfortunately, where, you know, people would say, well, it is how, and this is why Asian Americans feel so embarrassed about talking about racism. It still comes up with a lot of students I have where it's like, I feel like I haven't experienced, I feel like my experience is nothing compared to what other people of color have experienced, and I feel like I shouldn't say anything and stay quiet. And there's a real shame around that, and I think that was really enforced 5 years ago or so, where people were actively told to shut up, you know, because they were not, their problems were not severe enough, or their oppression wasn't severe enough. And I think that's a very capitalistic way of thinking about racial injustice. You know, that I think it's really important. I think it's, first of all, very important to understand that, you know, what Indigenous and Black people went through is very different, being with the Middle Passages and enslavement. And it's just not the same thing as being an immigrant here as an Asian. But at the same time, there are similarities. There are shared experiences that bring us closer together, and so that we can struggle together. And so I think sharing each other's experiences and listening and just being very supportive of each other. Like all the, you know, ICE is going after everyone, right? But it's definitely going for Latinos, predominantly Latinos, but it's also going at, ICE is going after Asian immigrants too. And so that's like a fight that we all need to engage in. And I've seen that too, where Asians are working for, or a lot of Asian lawyers too, who are working in fighting for racial justice for other groups. And I see the same thing. You know, so this sort of mutual engagement, mutual aid.
With 5 minutes left, this is a really great question and a deep one. How can we heal from our intergenerational trauma so we don't pass it onto our children?
Don't have children. That's probably the answer she didn't want. Oh, I mean, I can talk about my own experience. I'm a mother of an 11-year-old, and it's a constant struggle. It's, you know, it's ongoing. Healing is not like a one-time thing. You know, it's it's an ongoing experience, and I always have to work on myself as a mother. I think seeing a therapist, is absolutely crucial. That's how healing starts. I really think it's like almost mandatory that if you have a lot of intergenerational trauma and you're going to have a kid, see a therapist to process it, which I have. And it's helped me tremendously, because I think motherhood is very triggering in a way that I didn't think would happen. You know, I just assumed that you'd have all these like shared, like, you know, giving a kid a bath, and you're like, oh my God, this may be my, but you know, it just triggered a lot of bad memories. And I think a therapist helps, and just taking it like, day by day, and also talked about forgiveness and being able to forgive yourself, but also understand that, you know, the way you were raised is not the only way, that you don't have to, like what I do with my kid is like, don't talk back to me, or you have to show respect. And I think that like there's more, I think with immigrants, not just Asians, they have more, their parental child relationship is a little bit more authoritarian, where it's based more on obedience. And I really didn't want to kind of replicate that, you know, with my child. But, you know, when you're raised in that kind of environment, it's really hard to let go of it. So it's a constant reminder, and it's constant work with their child and with your partner. You know, I'm very lucky because I have a very understanding, very empathetic partner who's as involved, maybe more involved, you know, in the childcare.
Well, Cathy, thank you so much. Last words for our audience before we close.
I'm always bad with last words because I feel like they're literally the last words I can say. I just want to thank everyone. Thank you so much for being here. Yeah.